The night air hung thick over Savannah's waterfront, carrying the scent of rice fields and salt marsh. It was June 1775, and Samuel, a man of 40 years who had spent 30 of them enslaved on the Habersham plantation, stood in the shadows between two warehouses on the Bay Street docks. His hands, scarred from decades of labor, trembled slightly not from fear, but from something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. 3 days ago, a ship had arrived from Charlestown bearing news that shook the foundations of Georgia. Word had come. The British and the colonists were fighting, and somewhere in that chaos, Samuel and thousands like him saw something their masters hadn't intended: opportunity. "You hear that?" whispered Jacob, a younger man pressed against the warehouse wall beside him. He was barely 20, sold down from Virginia 2 years prior, and still carried the anger of that separation like a burning coal. Samuel listened. Distant music drifted from the taverns on Bay Street. White men, drunk, arguing about liberty and tyranny, about taxation and representation. The same white men who bought and sold human beings like cattle were speaking of their God-given rights. The irony wasn't lost on Samuel. "They're distracted," Samuel said quietly. "Confused. Scared. That makes them dangerous, but it also makes them vulnerable." Behind them, hidden in the darkness, 30 more souls waited. They were dock workers, field hands, house servants, craftsmen, each one enslaved, each one ready to risk everything. Tonight was just the beginning. Tonight, they would find out if the rumors were true, if British ships in the harbor really would offer sanctuary to those brave enough to reach them. Samuel took one last look at Savannah skyline, at the church steeples and merchant houses built on the wealth extracted from bodies like his. Then he nodded to Jacob. "Now," he said, "we go now. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in." Before we begin, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Savannah in 1775 was a city of approximately 3,000 people, but that number told only half the story. Nearly 2/3 of those souls were enslaved Africans and African Americans who built the city, worked its docks, cultivated its rice plantations, and served in its households. They were the invisible majority, the foundation upon which the entire Georgian economy rested. In the rice plantations surrounding the city, the enslaved population outnumbered whites by ratios that should have kept every slaveholder awake at night, and it did. The entire system of control, the patrols, the passes, the public whippings, the casual brutality existed because white Georgians understood a simple truth: they were outnumbered, and only terror kept the system functioning. Then came April 19th, 1775. Lexington and Concord. The shot was heard around the world. But which world? Celia had worked in the Wright household for 15 years, cooking meals for James Wright, the royal governor of Georgia. At 50, she moved with the careful economy of someone whose body hurt constantly, but who had learned never to show it. In the kitchen, she was queen, but it was a kingdom of cast iron and constant surveillance. The morning the news arrived from Massachusetts, she heard it before anyone told her. Heard it in the way Governor Wright's voice rose and fell in the study. Heard it in the hurried footsteps of messengers. Heard it in the pregnant silences that fell when she entered rooms. "Something's happening," she told her daughter, Dinah, that night as they walked back to the slave quarters behind the main house. Something big. Dinah was 17 and worked as a lady's maid. She had learned to be invisible, to stand in rooms where white people discussed things they would never say in front of slaves because they didn't think of slaves as people who understood, who remembered, who shared information. "They're scared, Mama," Dinah said. "Mrs. Wright was crying today. She kept saying the world is ending." Celia smiled grimly. "Maybe their world is. Maybe that means ours is beginning." Samuel had been hired out to work the dock for the past 5 years, a common practice where slaveholders rented their human property to others for labor. It meant Samuel had access to something precious: information. Every ship that came and brought news, every sailor had stories, every cargo manifest told him something about the shifting world beyond Savannah. He had also developed relationships. There was Thomas, an enslaved man who worked the fish market. Rachel, who sold vegetables and heard everything at the market stalls. Moses, a skilled carpenter whose work took him into different homes and businesses across the city. Together, they had formed an informal network, sharing information, building trust, waiting for their moment. Now the moment seemed to be arriving. The British are offering freedom, Thomas told him one evening in early May, speaking low as they unloaded barrels from a merchant ship. I heard it from a sailor off a ship from Charlestown, says the royal governor in Virginia. Dunmore's his name, says any slave who joins the British will be freed. Samuel's heart hammered. You sure? Sure as I can be without seeing it written. But think about it. Makes sense, doesn't it? The British need soldiers, need workers. We need freedom. Maybe we can use each other. That night, Samuel lay awake on the rough boards of his sleeping quarters at the Habersham plantation, mind racing. Could it be true? Or was it a trap? A way to identify potential rebels before crushing them? But then he thought, what did it matter? Even if it was a trap, what did they have to lose? What was this life worth protecting? By morning, he had made his decision. He would find out if the rumors were true, and he would help others find out too. Over the next weeks, the network expanded with remarkable speed. Information traveled through invisible channels, conversations in market stalls, whispered words in churches, coded messages in work songs. The white inhabitants of Savannah, obsessed with forming militia companies and debating whether to support the king or the rebels, failed to notice the parallel conversations happening all around them. Jacob, the young man sold down from Virginia, became a key connector. His anger made him fearless, and fearlessness made him persuasive. They're about to kill each other over taxes, he told a group gathered secretly in the woods outside town one Sunday. While they're distracted, we take what's ours. Our bodies, our families, our lives. Moses, the carpenter, brought practical skills. We'll need boats, he said. I've been watching the harbor. British ships anchor off Tybee Island at the river mouth. If we can get boats, we can reach them. Rachel, from a market, brought intelligence about patrol schedules. They've pulled men from the regular patrols to form military companies, she reported. The watches aren't as regular. There are gaps. And Celia brought something equally important, access to the governor's household, to the center of colonial power. She heard discussions of troop movements, supply problems, political divisions. She passed it all along. By June, they had a plan. A dangerous plan. A desperate plan. But a plan nonetheless. The night Samuel stood between those warehouses with Jacob, they weren't alone in their hopes. Across Savannah and the surrounding plantations, at least 30 enslaved men had agreed to attempt an escape to the British ships anchored off Tybee Island. The plan was simple in concept, treacherous in execution. Steal boats from the Savannah docks, row 18 miles downriver to the coast, and somehow reach the British vessels before being discovered, captured, or killed. Samuel's group would go first. If they succeeded, others would follow. If they failed, well, everyone knew the price of failure. The boats are ready, Moses whispered, emerging from the shadows. He had spent the past week loosening chains, preparing oars, hiding supplies. 3 boats, room for 15 in each. Should be enough for the first group. Samuel looked at the faces around him. Some he had known for years. Others he had met only in the past weeks. All of them had made the same calculation. The risk of staying had finally exceeded the risk of running. Anyone wants to back out? No shame in it, Samuel said quietly. This could go wrong in 100 ways. No one moved. Then let's go see if the British are as good as their word. The first part went smoothly, almost too smoothly. The boats slid into the dark water of the Savannah River with barely a sound. The oars dipped and pulled, propelling them downstream. Behind them, the lights of Savannah gradually diminished. The river was wide here, nearly a mile across, and they kept to the shadows along the Georgia bank. The moon was a thin crescent. They had planned for that, but it also meant navigation was treacherous. Currents with us, Jacob murmured from his position at the oars. Should make good time. They rowed in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours rest. the boats staying close together. As dawn approached, they pulled into the marsh along the riverbank to hide for the day. Rowing in daylight was suicide, too many plantation along the river, too many patrols. In the marsh grass, pressed into the mud, they waited. Mosquitoes swarmed. The sun beat down mercilessly. They had brought water and some cornbread, but not much carrying supplies would have raised suspicion. "You think they're really out there?" a young man named Peter asked Samuel. He was 18, born into slavery at a plantation upriver. "We'll find out tonight," Samuel replied. "But I'll tell you what I think. I think the British don't care about us. Not really. They just want to hurt the colonists. We're a tool to them. Then why are we doing this?" Samuel looked at him directly. "Because sometimes you can use someone who's trying to use you. They want to hurt the colonists? Good. So do I. If they'll give me freedom to do it, I'll take that deal, and once I'm free, I'll decide what comes next." What none of them knew was that their plan had already been betrayed by a man named Caesar, enslaved on a plantation near Savannah, had been promised his freedom and 50 pounds sterling for informing on the escape attempt. He had attended one of the planning meetings, learned enough to be dangerous, and gone straight to his master. As Samuel's group hid in the marsh, patrol boats were already being organized in Savannah. Armed white men, furious and frightened, were coming downriver. The patrol found them at dusk, just as Samuel's group was preparing to set out for the final leg to Tybee Island. There, in the marsh, opened fire. The world exploded into violence. Musket balls tore through marsh grass. Men screamed. Boats capsized. In the chaos and gathering darkness, the patrol couldn't see clearly who they were shooting at, but they fired anyway, again and again. Samuel dove into the water, swimming desperately for the deeper marsh. Beside him, Jacob took a musket ball to the shoulder and went under with a cry. Samuel grabbed him, kept him above water, dragged him into the reeds. "Go," Jacob gasped. "Leave me." "Go." "Shut up," Samuel hissed and kept pulling. Behind them, the patrol boats were spreading out, searching. They could hear the white men shouting, cursing, promising terrible retribution. By morning, the patrol had captured 14 men. Samuel and Jacob were not among them. They had escaped deeper into the marsh and eventually made their way separately back toward Savannah, traveling by night, hiding by day, finally returning to their respective plantations as if they had never left. But the captured 14 were not so fortunate. The white authorities decided to make an example. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. All 14 were convicted of insurrection and sentenced to death. On June 18, 1775, the 14 men were hanged in Savannah's public square. The authorities made it a spectacle, forcing the enslaved population to watch. The message was clear: this is what happens when you reach for freedom. But Samuel, watching from the required crowd, saw something else in those dying faces. He saw defiance. He saw dignity. He saw men who had tried, who had come closer than anyone before them, who had failed not because they were cowards, but because the odds were stacked impossibly against them. And he saw something else, the white faces in the crowd. They were frightened, truly frightened, because if 14 men would risk this, how many more were thinking about it? How many more were planning? The executions were supposed to end the resistance. Instead, they proved it had only begun. The summer and fall of 1775 brought increased tension to Savannah. The war was escalating. The British blockade tightened. Local militia drilled in the squares and everywhere. The enslaved population watched, waited, and planned. Samuel had learned from the Tybee Island failure. The problem hadn't been the concept. It had been the execution. Too many people, too much movement, too many ways to be discovered. What they needed was something bolder, faster, more decisive. That's when Celia came to him with information that changed everything. They met in the pre-dawn darkness at the market, a place where their presence together wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. Celia pretended to buy fish from Thomas, while Samuel stood nearby, unloading a cart. 3 ships, Celia said quietly, examining a grouper without looking at Samuel. Coming in next week. One's carrying weapons, muskets, powder, supplies for the militia. Governor Wright was discussing it at dinner. They'll be in harbor for 3 days before unloading. Samuel's mind raced. Weapons, ships, 3 days. How many people do we have we can really trust? He asked Thomas after Celia moved on. Maybe 40 in the city. Another 20 from a nearby plantations who could get here. But Samuel, we can't just take ships. We need to know how to sail them. Need to overpower armed crews. We need chaos, Samuel interrupted. That's what we need. If we hit them when they're already confused, when multiple things are happening at once, when they can't coordinate a response. Over the next weeks, the plan took shape. It was audacious to the point of madness. They would set fires at multiple warehouses along the waterfront, creating panic and drawing the night watch. In the confusion, a strike team would board the ships, seize the weapons, and attempt to commandeer at least one vessel. Those who would escape on the ship. Those who couldn't would at least be armed. It wasn't a perfect plan. People would die. Many would be caught. But Samuel was past the point of waiting for perfect plans. We're not asking anyone to come who doesn't want to, he told the group assembled secretly in a tobacco shed one night. But understand this, they're going to keep killing us. Slowly, through work and whipping and breaking our families apart, or quickly, on the gallows like those 14 men in June. Either way, we die. The question is whether we die trying to be free or whether we die in chains. Jacob, his shoulder healed but scarred, spoke up. I'm in. I was in for Tybee. I'm in for this. Moses nodded. I'll handle the fires. I know every warehouse on that waterfront. Noah will burn hot and fast. Rachel raised her hand. I can't fight, but I could get messages to the plantations, bring people in. One by one, they committed. 43 people in total. More than half would have roles that kept them away from the actual violence, providing distractions, blocking streets, spreading false information. The strike team would be just 12 people, including Samuel and Jacob. But once again, the network had been infiltrated. This time the informant was a man named Augustus, a house servant who had been promised his freedom and transport to England if he revealed the plot. He had attended 2 planning meetings, learned enough to be devastating, and went to the authorities on December 20th. Governor Wright convened an emergency session. Militia companies were alerted. Patrols were doubled, then tripled. Armed men took positions at the warehouses. Guards were placed on all ships in harbor, and they waited for the conspirators to spring their trap, not realizing they were walking into one. Samuel knew something was wrong the moment he approached the waterfront. Too quiet, too still. The warehouses that should have been guarded by a single watchman seemed abandoned, but he could feel eyes on him. It's a trap, Jacob breathed beside him. The signal came before they could retreat, church bells ringing wildly. That was Moses' signal for the fires. But Samuel hadn't given the order to start, which meant Moses had either panicked or gunfire erupted from the warehouses. White men poured out of hiding places, surrounding the approach to the docks. Samuel and Jacob ran, along with 6 others who had been with them. Behind them, more gunfire, screaming, chaos. They split up, vanishing into the narrow streets and alleys of Savannah's waterfront district. Samuel found himself pressed into a doorway, gasping, as a patrol ran past. He could hear more shooting, more shouting. The trap had been devastatingly effective. By morning, the authorities had captured 31 people connected to the plot. Some had been at the waterfront. Others were arrested at their plantations based on Augustus's testimony. Still others were simply suspected based on past behavior or attitude. The trials were swift and brutal. The authorities were determined to crush any further resistance before it could begin. Of the 31 captured, 6 were identified as leaders. They were sentenced to death. The executions took place on December 28, 1775. Once again, Savannah's enslaved population was forced to watch. Once again, the message was clear. But this time, something had changed. Among the 6 who died was Moses, the carpenter, who had built half of Savannah with his own hands. As the noose went around his neck, he didn't beg or plead. Instead, he looked out at the crowd, both white and black, and said clearly, I built this city. I earned my freedom 1,000 times over. You're not hanging a criminal. You're hanging a free man who just hasn't been recognized yet. They hanged him anyway. Samuel watched from the crowd, tears streaming down his face, not from grief alone, but from rage. Moses had been right. They were all free men and women, just not recognized, and no amount of hangings would change that truth. 3 years after the failed harbor plot, everything changed in a single day. British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell sailed up the Savannah River and took the city with minimal resistance. The American defenders, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, retreated in disarray. By nightfall, Savannah was British territory. For the city's enslaved population, it was the moment they had been waiting for. Samuel, now 43 and moving slower than he once did, heard the news from Thomas at the fish market. "They're here," Thomas said simply. "The British are here." That night, Samuel didn't sleep. He sat in his quarters at the Habersham plantation, listening to the distant sounds of the city, thinking about Moses, about those 14 men hanged after Tybee Island, about Celia's daughter Dinah, sold away and never seen again. And he thought, this is it. This is the moment. What happened over the next days and weeks was unprecedented in Georgia's history. Enslaved people simply walked away from plantations. They left in ones and twos at first, then in groups, then in dozens and scores. They walked toward Savannah, toward the British lines, toward the possibility of freedom. The British, for their part, were initially overwhelmed. They hadn't quite expected this response. Thousands of people suddenly appeared, seeking protection, claiming the promise of freedom. British officers scrambled to organize them, to figure out what to do with this sudden population. But the policy was clear, established by proclamation. Those who came to British lines would not be returned to slavery. They would be put to work for the British cause, yes, as laborers, guides, servants, even soldiers. But they would be paid. They would be free. Samuel left on January 2nd, 1779. He simply put down the cargo he was carrying at the docks, walked away from the ship he was unloading, and headed toward the British camp being established on the edge of the city. No dramatic escape, no running through the night. He just walked away, in daylight, as if he had every right to. Because he did. The British camp was chaotic. Hundreds of formerly enslaved people, now refugees, or black loyalists as the British termed them, crowded into a hastily organized tent city. There was insufficient food, inadequate shelter, and rampant disease. But there was also freedom. Samuel found himself assigned to work as a guide for British patrols. His knowledge of the surrounding countryside, the swamps and creeks and back roads, made him valuable. He was given a coat with British colors, a small wage, and most importantly, papers that identified him as a free man under British protection. He also found Celia. She had left the Wright household 3 days after the British arrival, walking out the front door while the family was arguing about what to do. Now she worked in the British camp kitchens, cooking for officers, and she was being paid for it. "Never thought I'd see this day," she told Samuel when they encountered each other in the camp. "Never thought I'd be free." "We're not free yet," Samuel cautioned. "We're protected by the British, which means we're free as long as they're winning. If they lose, if the Americans retake Savannah, then we run again," Celia said firmly. "But today, right now, I'm free, and that's more than I had yesterday." Life behind British lines wasn't paradise. The British were using formerly enslaved people for their own military purposes. Some black loyalists were armed and formed into irregular units. Others labored on fortifications. Still others served in various support roles. Disease ravaged the camp. Smallpox, typhus, and dysentery killed hundreds. Food was often scarce. The Americans launched raids that targeted black loyalists specifically, killing them when captured rather than treating them as prisoners of war. And there was the constant uncertainty. Would the British keep their promise? Would they evacuate their black loyalists if they left Georgia? Or would they abandon them to their former master's vengeance? But despite all this, people kept coming. By mid-1779, thousands of enslaved Georgians had made their way to British lines. Some estimates put the number at over 3,000 from Savannah and the immediate surrounding area alone. Entire plantations were left unworked. Georgia's economy was in free fall. The masters were frantic. They appealed to British commanders, demanded the return of their property and launched their own raids to recapture escapees. Some succeeded. Those recaptured faced terrible retribution. But many remained behind British lines, and the longer they stayed, the more the dream of freedom became real. Jacob had escaped to British lines in early January. At 23, he was young and strong, and the British quickly recruited him into one of their irregular units. He was given a musket, minimal training, and sent on patrols. In March 1779, his unit encountered an American patrol near a plantation 20 miles from Savannah. The ensuing firefight was brief and brutal. Jacob killed a man, a white American militiaman, and felt nothing except satisfaction. "Does that make me a monster?" he asked Samuel one night around a campfire. Samuel thought for a long time before answering. "The man you killed, was he fighting to keep you enslaved?" "Yes." "Then no, it doesn't make you a monster. It makes you a soldier fighting for your freedom. That's what war is." But Jacob wasn't sure. He had dreamed of freedom his whole life, but he had never imagined what it would cost, what it would require him to become. In September 1779, French and American forces laid siege to Savannah, attempting to retake the city from British control. For the thousands of black loyalists sheltering behind British lines, the siege was terrifying. If the city fell, they would be back in chains or worse. Many black loyalists were pressed into service, constructing fortifications, moving supplies, even fighting. Samuel found himself helping to build the earthworks that would defend the city. It was backbreaking labor, but it was labor for his own survival. Celia worked in field hospitals, tending to wounded British soldiers and black loyalists alike. The conditions were horrific: shattered limbs, infection, men screaming in agony. But she had steady hands and no shortage of courage. Jacob fought in the defense, positioned on the city's eastern fortifications. When the French and American forces launched their final assault on October 9th, he was in the thick of it, firing his musket at attacking soldiers, seeing men fall on both sides. The battle was savage. The assault failed, repulsed with heavy losses to the attackers. The siege was lifted. The British held Savannah. For the black loyalists, it meant a reprieve, but only a reprieve. For the next 2.5 years, Savannah remained under British control. For the black loyalists, it was a strange existence, free but uncertain, protected but vulnerable, surviving day to day while the war raged around them. More people continued to arrive, trickling in from plantations across Georgia. The black population under British protection eventually reached as many as 5,000 or more. They created a society within a society. Families reunited, new relationships formed, children were born free. Samuel, now in his late 40s, had become an informal leader in the camp. People came to him for advice, for help navigating the British bureaucracy, for hope when hope was scarce. Celia eventually found her daughter, Dinah. The girl, now a young woman of 22, had escaped from her plantation and made her way to Savannah after hearing her mother was there. Their reunion was tearful and joyous, a moment of unalloyed happiness in difficult times. Jacob survived, though the war left its marks. He had seen too much violence, done too much killing. But he had also found a wife, a woman named Mary who had escaped from South Carolina. They talked about the future, about where they might go if the British evacuated, about the lives they might build. When the British finally evacuated Savannah in July 1782, the question everyone had feared came to the fore. What would happen to the black loyalists? Under the terms of the preliminary peace treaty, American slaveholders demanded the return of all enslaved people. British commanders faced a moral and legal dilemma. They had promised freedom, but now they were being told to hand thousands of people back to their former masters. Some British officers, to their credit, refused. Sir Guy Carleton in New York famously insisted that the British word of honor meant those who had been promised freedom would not be returned to slavery. But different commanders in different places made different choices. In Savannah, the evacuation was chaotic. British officials created registers lists of black loyalists, recording their names, their former owners, their destinations. These books of Negroes were meant to document who was being taken, ostensibly so compensation could be paid to former owners. But there wasn't room on the ships for everyone. Choices had to be made. Priority went to those who had served most directly with British forces, those with useful skills, those with connections to British officers. Samuel, Celia, and Dinah were granted passage. They boarded a ship bound for Nova Scotia, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and papers declaring them free. Jacob and Mary were also granted passage, but on a different ship bound for Jamaica. But thousands of others, perhaps half of those who had sought British protection, were left behind. Some managed to escape into the wilderness. Others were recaptured by their former masters as soon as the British ships left the harbor. Those who were left behind faced terrible retribution. Planters who had lost their labor force for 4 years were in no mood for mercy. Recaptured black loyalists were whipped, branded, sold to the Deep South or the Caribbean, sometimes executed outright as examples. The plantations that had been abandoned were reoccupied. The system of slavery, disrupted but not destroyed, reconstituted itself. Within a year, it was as if the British occupation had never happened, at least for those who had been unable to escape. But for those who did get out, the story was different. Samuel, Celia, and Dinah arrived in Nova Scotia in August 1782. The land was harsh, the winter brutal, and the local white population often hostile. But they were free. They built a small cabin, farmed a small plot of land, and survived. Jacob and Mary ended up in Jamaica, where the prospects were slightly better, but the work was still hard. They had 3 children, raised them free, and died in their 60s, a remarkable longevity for people who had spent their early years enslaved. Samuel died in Nova Scotia in 1804, at the age of 69. In his final years, he told his story to anyone who would listen to his grandchildren, to visitors, to anyone who wanted to understand what had happened in Savannah during those chaotic years of revolution. He never forgot the 14 men hanged after Tybee Island. Never forgot Moses, who declared himself free even as the noose went around his neck. Never forgot the thousands who had risked everything, and the thousands more who had been left behind. We weren't supposed to win, he told his grandson one winter evening near the end of his life. The odds were impossible. Most of us died or ended up back in chains. But some of us got out. Some of us made it. And that means it was possible. That means it was worth trying. Celia outlived him by 8 years, dying at 76. She never returned to Georgia, never saw Savannah again. But she dreamed about it sometimes. The market where she had gathered intelligence, the kitchen where she had cooked for the royal governor while planning rebellion, the docks where she had watched ships come and go and hoped. I was a slave for 50 years, she told Dinah near the end, and I've been free for 30. That 30 years makes all the 50 years worth it. I got to see you free. I got to die free. That's more than most people like us ever got. Most of them lost. The system they fought against persisted for another 80 years after they fled. The plantations were rebuilt. The chains were reforged. But some of them won. Some of them got out. And in getting out, they proved something that the masters always feared. Given any chance at all, enslaved people would choose freedom. Every time, no matter the cost. They weren't waiting for emancipation. They weren't waiting to be saved. They were saving themselves, one dangerous attempt at a time, and that made them more revolutionary than any of the white men who penned declarations of independence while holding slaves. This one ends with Samuel, Celia, Jacob, and thousands like them, some free, some still enslaved, some dead, all of them having tried. Having reached for freedom when the moment came. Having proven that the human desire for liberty cannot be chained, cannot be whipped into submission, cannot be hanged in a public square. They were America's first freedom fighters. Not the ones in the history books. Not the ones celebrated with monuments. But the ones who understood freedom better than anyone. Because they had to fight for it with every breath. Do you think the British betrayed the slaves? Drop your comment below and don't forget to subscribe.